handouts moving around, so if you don't have one, there should be enough, certainly for everyone to share if they're not enough for everyone. So, at any rate, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which is the final event in a series of special events celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. Many of you have been regulars at our events for the last 10 years, and I hope you share our pride in all that Carolina has accomplished over the last decade. Today, we have a Jewish Studies program boasting an undergraduate major, a graduate certificate, and a vibrant offering of public events and lectures. The 15 of us who teach Jewish Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences are keenly aware that very little of what we've accomplished over the last 10 years would have been possible without the inspiring generosity of Carolina alumni and friends. So please know how much your tremendous investment in Jewish Studies is appreciated. By the new faculty we've brought in and the students whom they teach, by the remarkable students whose research in Jewish Studies we've been able to support, and by all those who were able to take advantage of the more than 80 public events and lectures we've put on since 2003. Tonight's lecture was made possible by a grant from the Charles H. Revson Foundation honoring Eli Evans, 58, founding chair of the Center's advisory board. Major gifts have played an important role in what we've been able to accomplish over the last decade. But so has annual giving, and we owe a tremendous debt to all the alumni and friends who have supported us, whether with an annual gift of $5, $50, or $500. Indeed, annual giving has been so essential to the success of Jewish Studies at Carolina that we have created a special challenge for our 10th anniversary. We are asking all donors to help double annual support giving this year by increasing their giving level and by sharing the Center's success story with others who may have an interest in Jewish Studies at Carolina. We are putting the final touches now in our events program for next year, which will start with a lecture by Gary Zola on Abraham Lincoln and the Jews on October 7th, and will include presentations by Moshe Rossman, Stuart Eisenstadt, Eric Klein, Arndt Engelhardt, Peter Schaefer, and Bill Morgan. Please check our website for more details over the summer. Please know how grateful we are for the inspiring support for Jewish Studies that our alumni and friends have shown us over the last 10 years, and please know what a tremendous difference your continued support will make as we embark on the Carolina Centers for Jewish Studies' second decade. Thank you.
Hi, my name is David Lambert, and it's my great pleasure to welcome actually my dissertation advisor to speak to us at UNC Chapel Hill. As you'll see in a moment, Professor Kugel has a very special aura about him. He manages to get things accomplished that are really quite extraordinary in these almost mysterious ways. Just to tell you a little story, I was in my third year of graduate school, and Professor Kugel was off the first term, the fall term. He came back in the spring term. He said to me, so David, you'll publish 2 articles, you'll go out in the job market in the fall, and you'll finish your dissertation in the spring. And as a third-year graduate student, I said, oh, okay, I had no idea how that could get done, and yet somehow it managed to happen. So, that kind of sort of serendipity is something quite extraordinary about Professor Kugel's scholarship as well. Professor Kugel has really, I think, to sum up the extraordinary, his extraordinarily insightful work, I think one could say, to take from the title of one of his books, that he's taught us all that if we really want to understand the Bible as it was, that we need to not only go back to its reconstructed origins, but to really understand the Bible as it was, we need to actually look at how it was actually interpreted. And lo and behold, we're actually able to trace, with the help of Professor Kugel, exactly what this early history of the Bible's interpretation was, in ways that end up being far less speculative and in many ways more critical-minded than what has often been produced as biblical scholarship in the past. Professor Kugel has had an absolutely decisive impact on the field, and he's also produced books which all of you should own in your libraries. The Bible as It Was, as I mentioned, wonderful book, and How to Read the Bible are extremely significant and extremely accessible books in the field. He taught at Harvard for many years, where his course, The Bible and Its Interpreters, regularly attracted about 900 students, more than 900 students. Very popular and important course. I would say that we are really honored to have with us today one of the most creative and influential scholars in biblical studies of his generation. So it's a great honor and a pleasure to introduce Professor James Kugel.
Well, thanks so much for that kind introduction. I have to say, I'm sure some of you must know that the University of North Carolina has been a center for research into the Bible and post-biblical writings for some time, and this tradition continues on in its present faculty and recent graduates. So I feel especially honored to have been invited to speak to you this evening. I wanted to begin by saying something, I hope you can all hear me, something about, in general, about ancient biblical interpretation before turning specifically to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Nowadays we know an awful lot more about the Bible than we did before. University scholars in places like Carolina or my former departments at Harvard and Yale have uncovered all sorts of previously unknown things about the Bible and the world of its origin. Nowadays, we know a lot about the individual books that make up the Bible, how they came into existence and when, and in some cases, why they were written. Thanks to the archaeologists, we also know a lot more about Israel's neighbors, as well as in what political and social circumstances different biblical events occurred. We know previously unknown languages of the region, ancient Egyptian, Akkadian, Hittite, Ugaritic. I'm sure you haven't heard of half of these, but I have to say I learned early on that one of the great advantages in studying dead languages is there's nobody around to correct your pronunciations. But in short, modern biblical scholarship has opened up the Bible to a whole new kind of understanding. And there's scarcely a paragraph in the Hebrew Bible that hasn't acquired new meaning in the light of all this research. But there's another group of biblical interpreters whose contribution has been, and in some sense continues to be, just as important as these modern biblical scholars. And it is about these ancient biblical interpreters that I wish to speak this evening. A school, or rather really several schools, of scholars flourished from, say, about 300 or so before the Common Era to the end of the first century of the Common Era. And these are the ancient biblical interpreters. We don't know much about them personally. In fact, with one or two exceptions, we don't know any of their names. But they, no less than the modern biblical scholars I just mentioned, succeeded in creating a revolution in the interpretation of biblical texts. By the time they came around, many of the books that were to make up our Bible had been around for centuries. What they set out to do was to interpret these books in new ways. And this was a highly significant development. They didn't write any manifestos on the subject of biblical interpretation, and the schools that they created have long since ceased to exist. But their ideas about interpretation, and in particular the conventions they established about how to go about reading the Bible, survived long after they themselves disappeared. In fact, to some extent, they even affect our way of reading the Bible today, as I hope to explain. Their way of interpreting has survived in part because conventions, once they get established, often have a way of going on and on. Even without anyone writing a word, their approach would no doubt have enjoyed a long life, as conventions often do. but their ideas were written down, reinforced in specific interpretations that they put forth in written form, in texts that interpreted the Bible and that were passed on from generation to generation. Some of these texts have turned up dramatically in the Dead Sea Scrolls, as I hope to explain, but probably equally significant for our knowledge of these ancient interpreters is a somewhat amorphous group of writings known by scholars and probably no one else by the somewhat unwieldy name of the Biblical Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. This is a collection of books that was, for the most part, written by Jews toward the end of the biblical period, but they were excluded for various reasons from rabbinic Judaism. It's only thanks to Christians that we have them today. Some of them actually came to be incorporated into the Christian Bible, or else just stored for centuries in Christian libraries in Greece and Italy and Egypt and Ethiopia and other places. You may have heard of some of the names of these books. They include adventure tales like the Book of Judith, or wise sayings, as in the Wisdom of Ben Sira or the Wisdom of Solomon. And then there are a lot of books that you never heard of, the apocalyptic visions, imaginary last wills, and testaments of various biblical figures, and so forth. What they all have in common is that they all contain little bits of biblical interpretations, brief asides sometimes about this or that biblical story, or explanations of a biblical law, or actual commentaries on long passages from Scripture. Thanks to this literature, we can figure out a great deal about what these ancient interpreters were up to. And as I said, they were really trying to change the way people read these texts. These interpreters were not simply trying to understand the Bible. When I say the Bible, I really mean the pre-Bible, because there wasn't an established canon of Scripture yet. But they had a definite program, a particular way of approaching these sacred texts. They were determined to read these ancient writings as if they were relevant to their own day. And that often meant putting a certain spin on its writings, reading everything they could as if it were not just history and not just about the past. To make this clear, let me mention a specific example that you probably all know. The Hebrew Bible begins by relating the story of Adam and Eve, the first human beings created by God. Everyone today knows that this story is basically about the fall of man. Adam and Eve were put in the Garden of Eden to lead a sinless, immortal existence, but then the devil, in the form of a serpent, tempted Eve to eat the apple, and the pair was kicked out of the garden forever. Ever since, human beings have been sinful creatures punished with death. But actually, none of the things I just mentioned is in the Genesis story itself. It makes no mention of the fall of man, nor is life in the Garden of Eden ever described as a sinless existence. It never says that Adam and Eve were supposed to be immortal. There is no devil in the story, just a talking snake, and in fact, no apple. It's just called a fruit. So all of these elements were created by the ancient interpreters I mentioned, and they have been superimposed, their interpretations have been superimposed on the words of the biblical story ever since. What is the story of Adam and Eve really about? Well, if you're a modern scholar, it's certainly still a puzzling story, but some have suggested that it's really about a significant moment that many societies experience, the transition from being a hunter-gatherer civilization to being a settled agricultural one. When you're a hunter-gatherer, you survive by eating whatever you happen to find growing on trees or running around in the wild. When you're a settled community growing your own crops, you don't run around and you survive on what you are able to harvest from the ground. I should say there's nothing natural about agriculture. It took a while to figure out that this was a way of living that actually worked a lot better than hunting and gathering. But it had to be discovered. It was certainly a courageous act to take a perfectly good grain of wheat that you could otherwise eat and instead throw it away, stick it in the ground, because someone told you that in 3 or 4 months a whole new stalk will grow up and your investment will be repaid tenfold or whatever. But people did discover that. That was a moment in the history of humanity, or rather several moments at different points around the globe. In fact, the ancient Near East was one of the first places, maybe the very first, in which agriculture was practiced, in part because a plant that was native to that region was particularly useful, and that is the chickpea, with which you could make hummus. I think they still do. Modern scholars don't think that the Bible actually preserves a historical memory of this transition to agriculture. It happened long, long before our most ancient texts were written. Rather, the story appears to be a kind of speculative recreation, perhaps based on reports of distant civilizations in which people had not yet made this transition, but survived by hunting and gathering and wandering around in a shocking state of undress. And so at first, Adam and Eve live in a marvelous garden where all their needs are supplied by picking fruit off the trees. But then they become wise by eating the forbidden from the forbidden tree, and suddenly they know much more than before. After that, Adam is punished in these terms. It says, "In toil you shall eat all the days of your life. You shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat your bread." In other words, Adam became a farmer. That wasn't the only thing that happened after Adam and Eve ate from that tree. As a result, it says their eyes were opened and they knew that they were naked. Humanity now acquired more and more sophisticated clothing, so that looking back now, those earlier days in the marvelous garden seemed childlike and primitive. Well, that's basically how this text looks to some modern scholars. As for the snake in the story, he seems to be just a snake. Snakes were actually worshipped in the ancient Near East. Perhaps the oldest Semitic inscription ever deciphered seems to speak of a mother snake figure. And snakes sometimes were thought to be wise in the Semitic world. In any case, the snake in the story is certainly not the devil. There's no devil in ancient Israel until much, much later, toward the end of the biblical period. So then how did this story become the Adam and Eve story that we know? The first change I really couldn't document. It happened slowly, but it was a change in the assumptions that people brought to the reading of the Bible. This change begins to be seen perhaps 500 or so before the Common Era, maybe even earlier. People, rather scholars, gradually came to assume certain things about the Bible. As I was implying before, I think in some cases it was really a willful assumption to assume certain things about the Bible that the Bible itself didn't say. In fact, some of them contradict what we normally think or assume about a text. And these are, I suppose I haven't given a lecture over the last 20 years that doesn't mention these four fundamental assumptions. So if you've ever heard me before, forgive me for repeating myself. The first assumption, and this is kind of counterintuitive, is that the Bible is a fundamentally cryptic book, that it says X, but often what it really means is Y. And all ancient interpreters seem to hold by this assumption, even though it isn't what we assume about other writings. It's what people assumed about the Bible. I confess I rather like that Monty Python movie called The Life of Brian. I don't know if you've ever seen that. But there is a scene at the beginning where it's during the Sermon on the Mount, but the Monty Python characters are all standing at the back of the crowd and they can't hear very well. And so when it comes to the verse, blessed are the meek, John Cleese or somebody says, "The Greeks, what's so good? Why should they be blessed?" And then the next thing they hear is, "Blessed are the peacemakers." But he doesn't hear very well either, and he says, "The cheesemakers, what's so good about the cheesemakers? Why should they be blessed?" And there's a sort of pedantic fellow standing next to him, and he says, "It's not to be taken literally." It means any maker of dairy products. So that is this first assumption. It's not to be taken literally. And really every ancient interpreter I ever read says that in one form or another. The second assumption is that these biblical texts are full of lessons. They're not just history, not just about the past, but they're history with a purpose. They're there to tell us how to behave, what to do. And in that sense, they're fundamentally relevant to us today, even though they refer to the past. The third assumption is that biblical texts, now we may be still a little bit before the canonization of certain texts as being in the Bible, but this ancient library of sacred texts, people were already starting to assume that they were perfectly consistent, that even though the prophet who wrote this book lived 150 or 200 years before the person who wrote that book, or maybe 500 years before this, or that they all are basically saying the same thing, that there are no contradictions, not only within individual books, but between one book and another. So Deuteronomy agrees with Proverbs, agrees with Genesis, and so forth. And the fourth and last assumption, and I put it last not out of disrespect, but because it seems to be evident only a little bit later on among these assumptions, is that every word of Scripture was divinely given or inspired or approved by God. Now, of course, nobody way back even would doubt that when the text says, "And the Lord said to Moses, saying, ... that what he said was indeed said by God. But now even those first words, "and the Lord said to Moses," acquired the same cachet as divine speech. So really everything in the whole book was divinely given. Those are the four assumptions. And in the case of Adam and Eve, these assumptions were crucial, especially the third, because on the face of it, there were a few glaring contradictions within the story. When God instructs Adam about what to do and not to do in the garden, he says as follows, "You may eat freely of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for on the day that you eat of it, you shall die." Now, the problem that bothered ancient interpreters was the phrase, "on the day that you shall eat of it." Actually, Adam doesn't die right away. He gets kicked out of the garden, but then he goes on to live to the age of 930. So why should the Bible say "on the day"? It wasn't a glaring contradiction, but still teachers would no doubt read this text to their students, copyists would copy it. They must have wondered at a certain point, why did this story have God say, "On the day that you eat of it, you shall die," if that turned out not to be true? Now, you might think that God was the sort of parent that I was, making vain threats to his children. Americans are pretty good about this, but I've spent some time in France, and, the French are always saying to their kids, "I'm going to call the police," So, but that wasn't a good, that really wouldn't convince anybody. Even if that were the case, why would you put it in the sacred book? It's bad enough it happened. So one solution that ancient interpreters came up with was that God's days are different from ours. After all, the Bible starts off by saying that the whole universe was created in 6 days. Now, that's an awful lot of stuff to create in a week. And so some people thought that, day must have some other meaning there. And there was a verse in the Bible itself that supported the idea that a yesterday of God's, or indeed a day of God's, lasted a period of 1,000 years. That is found in a verse in Psalm 90. It says, 1,000 years in your, that is God's sight, are like yesterday. 1,000 years are like yesterday for you. So maybe that's how long a day of God's is, 1,000 years. This idea is made explicit in a number of ancient Jewish and Christian texts. For example, in the New Testament, in the second letter of Peter, the text observes at one point, "But do not ignore this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are as 1 day." He didn't choose 1,000 years at random. It's based on this, even though he doesn't mention the psalm, it's based on Psalm 90. Similarly, in a later rabbinic text, Genesis Rabbah, it says, "1 day of God's is 1,000 years long, as it says in the Psalms, 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday." So here was one possible solution. When God says to Adam, "On the day that you eat of it, you shall die," he was referring to one of God's days. And indeed, Adam lives to the age of 930, which means he must have died sometime in the late afternoon of one of God's days. But this still left unanswered the basic question, why, if you want to punish him right away. I think it was a great Supreme Court justice of this country who said, "Justice delayed is justice denied." Why didn't God kill Adam right away? There was another possible explanation. It understood "you shall die" as not meaning you'll fall over dead, but you will become one who dies. You will become mortal. This explanation assumes that God had originally created Adam and Eve to be immortal. They would continue to live in the garden forever and ever so long as they obeyed the rules. I didn't mention this before, but certainly there was another tree mentioned in the story called the Tree of Life. Its function is not at all clear in the original story. It's only just mentioned. But for champions of this interpretation, it seemed to be in the garden to ensure Adam and Eve's immortality. Presumably, all they had to do was to take a hit off that tree every century or so, and their continued existence was guaranteed. I mean, I'm saying that. It doesn't say that in the story. So if "on the day that you eat of it, you shall die" really meant you shall become mortal, then the sentence was indeed carried out. They turned into ordinary human beings, and after a full, rich life of 900 years or so, ceased to exist. This interpretation is widely attested among the earliest interpreters that we have. Ben Sira, who lived at the beginning of the 2nd century before the Common Era, said in his book, "From a woman was sin's beginning, and because of her we all die." Forget about the woman part, but because of her we all die means that, that was the transition from immortality to mortality that is being spoken of. Similarly, in the book of 4th Ezra, written in the 1st century of the Common Era, it says, "You set one commandment on Adam, but he violated it. As a result, you established death for him and his descendants." Actually, though, the wording of this sentence highlights another problem in the story, one that bothered all ancient interpreters. It's fine for Adam and Eve to have been punished. After all, they violated the one commandment they were given and ate from the fruit of this tree. But what about me? Why should I be punished for what they did? I didn't eat from the tree. Well, certainly one possible answer was that mortality is hereditary. After all, heredity is a powerful force in life, as they used to like to say at Harvard. If your parents didn't have any children, the chances are you won't either. So maybe that's what happened. Adam and Eve became mortal, and this mortality was inherited by all their descendants, all of humanity. But ancient interpreters characteristically came up with a better idea. It wasn't mortality per se that was hereditary, but sinfulness. Adam and Eve had something in them that led them to disregard God's commandment, and ever afterwards, human beings have been disobeying and sinning and being punished in the same way. An alternate version of this same theme was that once they were kicked out of the garden, Adam and Eve could no longer have the possibility of living a sinless existence, so now they and their descendants were condemned to die forever. For people familiar with the New Testament, this must sound familiar, since the fall of man came to be a favorite Christian theme. But it actually was a favorite Jewish theme. in the first century of the Common Era. Here again is 4th Ezra, a first century book. For the first Adam, burdened with an evil heart, transgressed and was overcome. Thus the disease became permanent. O Adam, what have you done? For though it was you who sinned, the fall was not yours alone, but ours also, who are your descendants. And there is, arguably one of the earliest uses of the phrase fall of man. Well, there's much more to say about this story, and perhaps we can return to it later, but I hope I've given you an idea of how these ancient interpreters worked. They read very carefully, great attention to every word on the day that you read of it, and then they transformed the text. Suddenly, the story of Adam and Eve is no longer about the invention of agriculture and more elaborate clothing, but instead it is all about morality and mortality, God's commandments and the disastrous effects of not obeying them. Quite consciously, at least at first, these interpreters set about reconfiguring as much as they could of those ancient texts to make them correspond to their own highly ideological, God-centered outlook. The stories of Genesis, all of them, were, as it were, written anew, not by changing any of the words, but changing the basic assumptions with which those words were approached, as well as what those words were interpreted to mean. And now I'd like to turn to the things on your handout and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and give you some examples of the biblical interpretation that scholars have found in them. The first scroll I wish to talk about was among the very first to be discovered. You may know that the first scrolls were discovered near the shores of the Dead Sea, that's why they're called that, by some Arab shepherds in the winter of late 1946 or early 1947. The central figure in their discovery was a young man nicknamed Muhammad ad-Dib, which means Muhammad the Wolf, at a place called in Arabic Qumran. You can visit it today and see the rocky cliffs with caves high on the face. Anyway, 3 shepherds from a Bedouin tribe, the Ta'amira, were in this area. One of the boys started throwing rocks up at the cliffs, and as luck would have it, one of his rocks landed inside a cave, and this was followed by a shattering sound, like the sound of pottery being broken, which is actually what it was. 2 days later, Muhammad, whose real name is Muhammad Ahmad al-Hamid, got up early and went back to the site of the cave. Squeezing into its narrow opening, he found 10 jars, 2 feet high, containing scrolls, some of them, some wrapped in cloth. Muhammad took 3 scrolls, later identified as one of them was part of the book of Isaiah, the second was a commentary on the biblical prophet Habakkuk, and a non-biblical book later came to be known as the Community Rule. After that, 4 more scrolls, another partial manuscript of Isaiah, something called the Thanksgiving Hymns, no connection to our holiday, the War Scroll, and then something later called a Genesis Apocryphon. These were retrieved from the same cave. The Genesis Apocryphon is the scroll I want to talk about tonight. The scrolls were brought to an antiquities dealer from Bethlehem named Kando. That was his nickname. His real name is Khalil Iskander, which is Alexander Kando Shachin, a Syrian Christian and a sharp businessman. At first, he bought 4 scrolls on behalf of his church, St. Mark's monastery, or associated with his church, from the Bedouin for 24 British pounds, or approximately $100. A Syrian church official, Athanasius Yeshua Samuel, wanted to know what he had just acquired, and among other things, he contacted a professor at the Hebrew University, Eliezer Sukenik. Sukenik soon found out that there were 3 more scrolls for sale from Kando, so he went to visit him. This was a very difficult time to travel from the Jewish part of Jerusalem into Bethlehem. Actually, the day in question was November 29th, 1947, when the United Nations voted to divide Palestine into Jewish and Arab halves. They included the text I mentioned. the Genesis Apocryphon, and he saw it, and thus the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls came into the consciousness of the academic world. Sukenik courageously identified the scrolls as authentic. In fact, he said they probably came from an ancient Jewish group called the Essenes, because Pliny the Elder, a Greek writer of the 1st century of the Common Era, had said there was an Essene settlement near or on the shores of the Dead Sea near Ein Gedi, which is more or less where the scrolls were found. Now, the Genesis Apocryphon is a strange text. It consists of a series of first-person narratives by various biblical figures: Noah, his father Lamech, Abraham, and others. Each of these figures recounts, not in Hebrew, but in the related language of Aramaic, events from his own life, the same events that are related in the Bible, with a lot of extra details thrown in. At first, scholars were somewhat puzzled by this text. Actually, I think some are still puzzled. But what was it for? Some people believed that it was an attempt to fool the public, to pass off these documents as the authentic words of these ancient figures. I don't think so. There really doesn't seem to be any reason to do so, and the Aramaic makes no attempt to sound ancient. It's basically the same Aramaic as was spoken by Jews at the time the text was written, presumably in the 1st century of before the Common Era. Its real purpose seems to have been to present the stories of these various figures in a way that explains and elaborates on the biblical text. In short, this is ancient biblical interpretation. Actually, it's funny. We know biblical commentaries. I'm sure you've seen these that quote a verse from the Bible, and then the commentator explains what he or she thinks it means. That wasn't the most popular form of commentary. It existed in ancient times, but rather more popular was the process of retelling a biblical text, and in the retelling, explaining what you thought the text meant. Modern scholars at first failed to realize this. Thank goodness, or I really wouldn't have had anything to do. They thought that the things being added to biblical narratives were kind of poetic flights of fancy, little embellishments, but actually they were mostly little bits of ancient biblical interpretation, things the author knew and probably expected his readers to know as well. For the most part, ancient biblical interpretation is about problems, things that seem puzzling or downright wrong in the biblical text, and that's true of the Genesis Apocryphon as well. There was one incident in Genesis that was particularly troubling to ancient interpreters in the life of Abraham, and you can see it in the passage numbered number 1 on your handout. It occurs when Abraham has gone down from the land of Canaan to Egypt. It says in Genesis there was a famine in the land of Canaan, so Abraham, really his name is still Abram here, went down to Egypt to dwell there, since the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, that is Sarah, "Now I know well that you are a beautiful woman, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me and keep you alive. So say you are my sister, that way it may go well with me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account." When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abraham, so that he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. Well, why was all this troubling to interpreters? It's hard to avoid thinking that Abraham behaves in a somewhat cowardly fashion, ready to sacrifice his wife to save his own skin. Not only that, but he doesn't seem to express any regret about Sarah being taken from him by Pharaoh. In fact, it looks as if he laughs all the way to the bank, since Pharaoh gives him all those sheep and oxen and male donkeys and so forth, apparently as a bride price. So how can an interpreter save Abraham's reputation? Sometimes interpreters, when they don't have an answer to the big question, try to divert their readers with a little question, and that's what happened in this case. When Abraham tells Sarah to say she's his sister, He starts off by saying, "Now I know well that you are a beautiful woman." Well, this raised an interesting question, and a number of interpreters seized on it. Look at passage number 2 on the handout, which is from Genesis Rabbah. It says, which is a 4th century commentary, when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarah, "Now I know that you are a beautiful woman." Actually, "know well" is a kind of attempt to gloss over this problem. I took that from a modern translation, but it just says, "Now I know that you are a beautiful woman." The commentator continues, "She had been with him for all these years, and only now he says to her, 'Now I know that you are beautiful.'" But people usually become unattractive when they are on the road. Rabbi Azariah, in the name of Rabbi Judah, son of Rabbi Simon, said, "Abraham said to Sarah, 'We have traveled through southern Mesopotamia and northern Mesopotamia, and I haven't seen any woman as pretty as you. Now that we are about to enter a land whose people are generally ugly, say you are my sister. In that way it may go well with me because of you.'" Right? So actually these are different interpretations. Abraham seems to be saying in the first one, look, I know most women use all those cosmetics and creams and powders and stuff to look beautiful, but we've been traveling all these months, living in tents and sleeping bags and getting dirty, but you still look just as beautiful as you were back home. Now I know that you are a truly beautiful woman. The second explanation, Rabbi Azariah's, is a little different. In it, Abraham seems to be saying, "Sarah, I always knew you were the prettiest woman in our homeland of Ur, but since we left, I confess I've had my eye out, and wherever we went, southern Mesopotamia, northern Mesopotamia, I've been checking things out, and I've never seen anyone as beautiful as you. Now I know that you are truly a beautiful woman." The third passage comes from Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. This is an unfortunate way of referring to this old Aramaic translation. For a while, people, modern scholars, even thought it was a Targum by someone named Jonathan. Now they know that that isn't so, but it isn't fair to call him Pseudo-Jonathan. It wasn't his fault. In any case, this translation presents a different understanding. It says that when Abraham and Sarah got to the Egyptian border, there was a river to cross. Up until then, the pair had a typically modest Jewish marriage, and Abram had never seen Sarah naked. In fact, there's a variant version of this story, according to which, even at this moment, Abraham averted his eyes, but by accident, he caught a glimpse of Sarah's reflection in the water and said, "Ooh." Anyway, "Now I know that you are a beautiful woman." Well, all that, as I said, seems designed to distract us from the main issue, which is Abraham's apparent cowardice and, in fact, indifference to his wife being taken from him for cash. But unlike these later texts, the Genesis Apocryphon, that Dead Sea Scrolls text, really takes the bull by the horns. This is passage number 4 on the handout, according to which Abraham had a dream on his way down to Egypt. Says, "And I, Abram, had a dream on the night of my entering the land of Egypt, and I saw in my dream that there was a cedar and a date palm, and some men came and wanted to cut down and uproot the cedar while leaving the date palm alone. But the date palm objected and said, 'Don't cut down the cedar, because the two of us are from the same root.' So the cedar was left alone, thanks to the date palm, and was not cut down. Then I woke up," this is Abraham speaking, "from my sleep, and I said to my wife Sarai, 'I had a dream, and I am frightened by this dream.' She said to me, 'Tell me your dream that I may know.' So I began to tell her the dream. Then I explained to her the meaning of the dream, and I said," and here there's a break in the text, "'Men who will wish to kill me and leave you alone. Now here is the favor that you might do for me, wherever we may be. Say about me, he's my brother, and that way I will live thanks to you, and my life will be spared because of you.' And Sarah wept because of my words that night." So this really does solve the problem. Dreams in the ancient world were conceived to be a message from God, and so it was in this case. If so, Abraham could hardly be accused of cowardice. He was simply ordered by God to do what he did. But at this point, you might object and say, well, that's very nice, but there isn't any dream in the biblical story. How dare this interpreter make up something that isn't in the Bible? To which our ancient interpreter would answer what all ancient interpreters answer under these circumstances, namely, you're not reading the biblical text carefully enough. Well, what did he mean in this case? The author of the Genesis Apocryphon would point to one particular verse that gave him the clue that he wanted, and it was none other than the same verse that I've been talking about, namely Abraham's words to Sarah, "Now I know that you are a beautiful woman." The author of the Genesis Apocryphon doesn't understand this verse in the way that the rabbinic interpreters did. Before this, I didn't know you were so beautiful. Instead, he understands the "now I know" part as referring to the rest of the sentence. That is, now I know that since you are a beautiful woman, the Egyptians will see you and want to kill me. That might not seem to imply the existence of a divinely sent dream, but our interpreter would point out that Abraham doesn't say, I think that since you are a beautiful woman, they'll try to kill me. I fear that, or anything like that. He knows. In fact, combined with the word now, this expression in Hebrew might even be translated as, now I have just found out. But how could Abraham have just found out something that hasn't happened yet? Only if God had somehow told him the future. And what more natural way to do that than via a prophetic dream? Well, time's getting a little short, so I won't bother reading the whole of number 5 on the handout, since I've highlighted the essence of the problem. Genesis says that God started off creation by saying on the first day, let there be light. But what sort of a light was it? It couldn't have been the light of the sun or the moon, since they weren't even created until the 4th day of creation. This is the first, and he says, let there be light. So interpreters came up with a good idea. Since God was creating the whole universe, he must have needed an especially strong light, one that would allow him to see from one end of the universe to the other. This especially powerful light was used for the first 6 days of creation, but then it must have been put aside because God didn't need it anymore. So this is what all those ancient interpreters were saying when they described that primal light. If you look at numbers 6 through 9 in the handout, they all say more or less the same thing. The first day, the one in which the light was born, by which all things are visible at once. Or the 4th book of Ezra, so that all your works might then appear. Josephus, and even the translation, the common Aramaic translation still in use today, says, and God said, let there be light to illuminate the world. Well, that isn't in the book of Genesis, but that's how he understands this light. It has to be a very strong light that will light up the whole world all at once. There's even a text from Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls that seems to say the same thing, that this light stretched from one end of the universe to the other. Unfortunately, the word for end, which begins in Hebrew with the letter kuf, that's the only, then the text breaks off, but it seems that's what it says. But then there is number 10 on your handout, the hymn to the Creator. We don't know the original name of this hymn. I want to make sure I'm giving you the right numbers here. Is that indeed 10? Yeah, that's right. We don't know what this hymn was originally called. Scholars gave it the name, the Hymn to the Creator. But it was found in a psalm scroll in cave number 11. Listen to the words. Again, I won't read the whole thing. The crucial line I put in italics. He separated light from darkness. He prepared the dawn in the knowledge of his heart. Then all the angels saw and exulted, since he had shown them what they did not know before. Here, as you can see, there is no super strong light. Instead, when it says that God said, let there be light on the first day of creation, what the text is talking about is what went on in God's mind. He prepared the dawn in the knowledge of his heart. He thought up the idea of light on the first day, along with the idea that once the sun would be created on the 4th day, it would certainly contain what God invented on the first day, that is, light. I'm going to get a little water. And he also thought of the idea that that light would fade into dusk and reappear as dawn the next day. And that's why it says he prepared the dawn in the knowledge of his heart. This was a great explanation. It not only accounted for let there be light, but it also answered another question I asked before. How could each day of the 6 days of creation end, and it was evening and it was morning the first day, and it was evening, it was morning the second day, if there wasn't any sun? I mean, that is what determines evening and morning, or dawn. And the sun wasn't created until the fourth day. The answer is that God thought up the idea of light, including sunlight, and the length of the day from evening to evening, morning to morning, the evenings and the mornings that it would mark off, that was already thought up on the first day. And that's why the Bible can say it was evening, it was morning, even though the sun didn't yet exist. Well, the author of the hymn to the Creator didn't make this up on his own. He owed this idea to an exegetical genius, name unknown, who wrote a certain book called the Book of Jubilees, certainly one of the greatest biblical interpreters of all time. You can see his words in number 11 on the handout. That was his idea. In the last line quoted, he asserts that on the first day of creation, God made a lot of things, including at the very end, darkness and light, dawn and evening, which he prepared through the knowledge of his mind. Exactly the same phrase as in the hymn to the Creator. Well, I'm running out of time, so I'll just summarize the last interpretive problem answered in this selection from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It concerns the Ten Commandments. Everyone knows that the Ten Commandments were written on 2 stone tablets that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. But why were there 2? You could easily, I mean, anybody who knows ancient writing knows you could easily fit all 10 commandments on 1 tablet. Moses is an old guy. Why make him carry 2? But then further examination reveals that the opening commandments are about things between God and man, not worshiping other gods, not taking God's name in vain, keeping the Sabbath, God's day, while the later commandments all have to do with things that that take place between one person and another. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't give false testimony against your neighbor, and don't covet. So that's why you need 2 tablets, one for God and man, the other for man and his fellow. But there was a problem with that as well. The division was asymmetrical. There are 6 commandments dealing with human relations, starting with honor your father and mother, and only 4 dealing with God and man. People don't like asymmetry. So very early on, an apologetic motif developed to the effect that the 5th commandment was almost about God and man. As Philo of Alexandria, who's an important interpreter, as he says in number 13, parents are really a little like God in that they too create. They create their own children. So in a sense, they're the perfect transition from the first tablet to the second. Philo lived in the early 1st century of the Common Era. Actually, he was born in the closing decades, the decade or two of the 1st century before the Common Era. So scholars like to say he was kind of in one era and out the other. But the author of the Qumran text in number 14 was earlier than Philo, and he says pretty much the same thing. Honor your parents is rightly on the first tablet, since parents were godlike as far as their children were concerned. That was a long time ago. And they are, beside that, the smelting pot of their children's creation. But what's the point of the second paragraph in number 14? Well, I'll leave that for you to figure out, or perhaps we'll bring it up in the questions. I'd just like to end by saying in the next 2 minutes, but not by way of summary, I hope you've followed everything I've said tonight, but rather give you a very sketchy mention of what I consider to be the Dead Sea Scrolls' greatest contribution to the whole subject of biblical interpretation. What I want to say brings me back to the modern biblical scholars I mentioned at the start of my lecture. One of the things they have discovered is that almost all of the books of the Bible started out looking very different from the form they finally acquired. Almost all of them had things added into them that were not part of the original book. An extra sentence here or there, a little inserted explanation, and in addition, the order of their contents was often shifted around. Few scholars today doubt, for example, that the last 27 chapters of the book of Isaiah, 27 chapters, were composed by an anonymous writer some 150 years after the time of the original prophet Isaiah. Apparently, these extra chapters were just tacked onto an existing prophetic book. The book of Jeremiah seems to have acquired at least 10 new chapters over the course of time, and its other chapters were reordered as well. Similar insertions and modifications have been identified in other parts of Scripture. In fact, malleability seems to have characterized the early career of a great many biblical books. Even in the period of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is pretty late, some alterations could still be introduced into the text, but of a relatively minor nature. That's what we see, a kind of narrowing funnel. Now, back in the 6th or 5th century before the Common Era, major changes were still the rule, but by the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're getting to the narrow end of the funnel. You could still make changes, but pretty minor ones. Eventually, biblical text would become altogether inalterable, petrified. Or would they? What I wanted to demonstrate with the examples we have looked at tonight is that this narrowing funnel is actually an illusion. The old malleability merely took on a new form, moving from the actual alteration of the text to the reinterpretation of the text, sometimes of the most wildly imaginative sort. Abraham had a prophetic dream. The light of the first day of creation was super strong, or else just God's good idea. The Ten Commandments really are symmetrical despite all appearance. This process may be seen in the few examples from the Dead Sea Scrolls examined tonight, but in hundreds of others from elsewhere in the scrolls and in the biblical apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. In the beginning, one might say, God created the malleability. And this malleability was built into the very idea of Scripture that prevailed among Jews and Christians for a great many centuries after the first century of the Common Era. It is really only recently that we have reduced the Bible's meaning to the words on the page, a wooden, literalistic approach that no one had at the time that the Bible was first canonized. This is the most important lesson that one can learn today from the ancient biblical interpreters, and it is one that we might well take to heart. Thank you very much. I know there's time for some questions, so I'd be happy to try to answer them if I can. Yes, sir.
When you spoke of the four assumptions, whose assumptions are these? The assumptions of the true believer or the person who is endowed with the right to perform exegesis? Whose assumptions are these?
Okay, well, I'll try to repeat the question because I know not everybody heard it. Who were the people who were assuming these four assumptions that I mentioned? Were they true believers, or exactly who? Well, actually, we don't know what ordinary people assumed, or if they even thought about these things. All we have are the texts that were written down, And they were written down by, an extraordinarily varied bunch of people. I mean, if you think about someone like Philo, who I just mentioned, he lived in Alexandria in Egypt. Scholars think he may not have known a single word of Hebrew. He read the Bible in Greek. His whole education was Greek. He's very, very different from the author of the Book of Jubilees, who was, very much against Hellenism in any of its forms, and who lived in the land of Israel, probably in Jerusalem itself, and wrote in Hebrew. And he was very different from Ben Sira. Ben Sira was a total creature of the establishment. He hung out with the important politicians of the day, whereas the author of Jubilees was kind of a rebel. But they all shared the same four assumptions. So one has to think that they were around before any of these manifestations, and they probably came by these assumptions because they were all schooled in the ways of ancient Near Eastern wisdom. Each of these, I can't really go into it here, but each of these has its roots in the way ancient sages thought about life, and this is a kind of projection of their outlook onto actual texts. It's a good question. Yes, sir. Well, King Josiah, I think everybody agrees, was certainly a much appreciated king, to put it in American terms, he was almost a kind of Kennedy-like figure. Unfortunately, also, he died before his time. And he, probably his court was responsible for a good bit of our Bible. But he's really before this great age of interpretation that I've been talking about. Anyone else? Yes, way in the back. Yes, Rabbi.
The malleability of the various books of the Bible. Was there more malleability to later books like prophets than to the 5 books of Moses? How much of the 5 books of Moses changed since?
Well, that's a wise question, I think. It's certainly true that the form of the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, was, from the evidence that we have from Qumran, rather more stable. It's actually a subject that's being debated right now by scholars. There are a bunch of texts, really seems to have been parts of a single text that from the Dead Sea Scrolls that scholars have named the reworked Pentateuch. Actually, the name keeps changing because we're not really sure. Is it a commentary on the Pentateuch? It's not a very thick commentary. Here and there, it's a fragmentary text, but it generally seems to follow what we know from the Pentateuch. Sometimes it takes things from the book of Deuteronomy that really refer to what happened in the time of Exodus, and it inserts them in the book of Exodus. But we happen to know that there's a version of the Torah, of the Pentateuch, that's used by Samaritan Jews to this day that does the same thing. In fact, this text bears some resemblance to the Samaritan Pentateuch. It's a little more daring in a few places. For example, in the book of Exodus, after the Israelites cross the Red Sea, they're saved, they sing a hymn of praise to God. This is chapter 15 of the book of Exodus. And after that it says, then Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand and a drum, and she she and the women sang, and it gives the first line of the song, and it's the same song that Moses sang, so presumably they sang the same song. Well, not in one of these Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts. It very much looks like the ordinary Torah or Pentateuch, except when it gets to Miriam's song, and suddenly there's a different song there. So it's very fragmentary. We don't know what exactly it said. It seemed to be talking also about the crossing of the Red Sea, but in very different terms. And why would somebody stick this into the middle of a text of the Pentateuch? Maybe it was some proto-feminist. No, it's possible. We don't really know, but it's amazing because here we are in maybe the 2nd or 1st century before the Common Era, and somebody's still fiddling with the text. The most sacred text for Jews at the time, and I suppose down to this day, was the Pentateuch, the Torah. And yet it was apparently not immune to change more or less at the whim of the sage or scribe who was copying it. So even that was a sign of malleability. Yes?
Was any of the early interpretation based upon grammatical inconsistencies as later Midrash is, or is it based more on content questions as you described?
Wow, that's a very good question. I think the answer is that very much for the most part, they were interested in content questions, plot questions. Why does this happen? What was he thinking when that happened? But it wasn't why this word and not that word. That was a particularly rabbinic approach to the text that you don't find much of that earlier on. Good point. Yes?
I'm wondering, Professor, if what you're indicating is that the need for the original literature, the purpose of the literature changed over time. And if in the beginning, in giving that word, it was to take a group of tribes that were fairly primitive and provide some rules and regulations for which we were going to live. But is it possible that the later commentaries really were a way for us, once we accepted our own humanity, to philosophically look at the world that we lived in?
Well, I don't think I could sign off on all of that. The question was, what I would let me take the positive route and take your initial formulation. It is true that these interpreters lived in a different time, and they had a different program, a different set of things that they wanted to accomplish in the course of interpreting. And in some ways, it was at odds with the very words of the text. But the wonderful thing was, it didn't matter. They were authoritative interpreters. I mean, it's hard to, think of them. And nowadays, you sort of think of, these were like professors, who cares what they think. But they were, figures in society. They mattered for something. And if they said, this is what the text means, people said, well, he must know. So it was definitely that. It was a kind of program for change suited to a different time. Yes. Yes, sir. Yes, you. Yeah, please.
It's my understanding that the Septuagint was composed and put together around 200 or 300 BCE. It was considered canonical. And then about 200 or 300 years later, the Palestinian canon, the present Bible, was put together. And in that process, about 6 books from the Septuagint were removed as apocryphal. So my question is, what methodology or how did they decide that those 6 books were not canonical?
Yeah, no, it didn't quite happen like that. The question was started off about the Septuagint, which is the old Greek translation, first of the Pentateuch and then of other books, and that's very old. The translation of the Torah goes back to the 3rd century before the Common Era. Much later, when Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, he classified a certain number of books that had been in use by some Jews up until then as apocryphal or deuterocanonical, and they kind of were dropped to a different rank. But that happened at the end of the 4th century of the Common Era. I think I sense I'm being shut up, so.
My sense is that there are a lot more questions, but we also have a reception out in the lobby. So why don't we all continue the conversation out there? Please join me in thanking Professor Kugel for attending this question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me get you out.
Okay.
You want to take this off? Or do you want to keep
Oh, yeah. No,
keep it as a souvenir? It might